There's a moment, and I've only seen it twice in my entire career, where an entire room goes completely silent. Not quiet silent. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat, and it sounds embarrassingly loud. The kind where even the ventilation systems in a pressurized station seem to hold their breath. I was there for both moments. The first one, I was 19 years old, fresh out of the Interspecies Diplomatic Academy on Vethara Station, holding a clipboard I didn't need, and trying very hard to look like I belonged in a room full of people who absolutely knew I didn't. The second moment, the one I actually want to tell you about, happened about 6 years later, on a military transit hub called Orinthex 7, somewhere in the outer edge of what most galactic charts just label contested corridor and leave deliberately vague. I've told this story at 4 different debriefs. 3 times the people listening leaned forward. 1 time, a senior Velhari admiral, a species that doesn't show emotion in any way humans recognize, put down her stylus and just stared at me for about 11 seconds without blinking. 11 seconds is a long time when someone's staring at you. Afterward, she said something that I keep coming back to. She said, and I'm translating loosely here because Velhari has about 47 inflection layers that don't map cleanly into standard, she said. The disturbing thing is not that humans are dangerous. The disturbing thing is that they don't seem to know. I've been thinking about that ever since. And if you'll give me a few minutes, I'll tell you exactly what she was talking about. Orinthex 7 is not a place anyone chooses to go. It's a through place, a between place. The kind of facility that exists because interstellar logistics demand it, not because anyone looked at that particular patch of space and thought, yes, let's build something here, this feels right. The station had been retrofitted 3 times in 60 years, once by the Keth Collective, once by the Meridian Trade Authority, and once by a consortium of species I won't name here for political reasons that are frankly still relevant. What you end up with after 60 years of retrofitting is a station that feels like it was designed by a committee where every member disagreed with every other member and nobody ever resolved the arguments. They just kept building around them. Corridors that were 6 feet wide became 12 feet wide, became 4 feet wide again within the same hallway. Ceilings that soared 40 feet in one section dropped to just under 8 in the next. Lighting panels from 3 different eras coexisted in the same bay, giving off 3 slightly different shades of white that somehow combined into something that wasn't quite any of them. It was, in short, an ugly place. Functional, but ugly. The kind of station that smelled like recycled air and old machinery, and the faint, indefinable scent of about 40 species who'd all passed through recently and left trace atmospheric signatures behind. I was there as part of a diplomatic escort team, very junior member. My job, basically, was to stand in the right places and look like I was doing something important while the actual diplomats did the actual diplomacy. We were accompanying a mid-level Meridian Trade delegation. 6 officials, 2 aides, a cultural liaison named S. Savith who was Keth Brood and genuinely lovely, once you got used to the fact that she had 8 eyes, and used all of them simultaneously, through a transit negotiation that was supposed to take 2 days and ended up taking 9. The delegation had been housed in one of the mid-tier residential blocks on the station's 3rd ring. Not the nice part, not the worst part either. The middle part, where everything worked but nothing was comfortable, and the food synthesizers produced meals that were technically nutritionally complete, but tasted like someone had described food to a machine that had never eaten. By day 4, everyone was tired and a little frayed. By day 7, the fraying had become something more like unraveling. I won't go into the details of the negotiations themselves. That's classified for another 14 years, I'm told. But I'll say that tensions between the delegations involved were running high enough that security had been upgraded twice since we arrived. By the time day 8 rolled around, there were Meridian security personnel at every major junction, 2 Keth compliance officers stationed outside the negotiation suite, and a rotating patrol of galactic enforcement soldiers moving through the residential rings every 4 hours. Galactic enforcement, GE, people called them, though not usually to their faces, were not beloved. They were a coalition security force, technically neutral, practically nobody's friend. They answered to the Interspecies Security Council and operated on a mandate that gave them authority to intervene in any situation, deemed a threat to interspecies stability, which was language broad enough to mean almost anything and specific enough to mean whatever the ranking officer decided it meant. The soldiers on rotation at Orinthex 7 were a mixed unit, 4 species represented, which was standard for coalition ops. You had Velhari, who were tall, gray-skinned, and moved like they were conserving every calorie. Thavari, who were broader, almost spherical in their upper bodies, with 4 arms they used in pairs. Rendaki, who had an exoskeleton that clicked faintly when they moved and eyes that tracked independently of each other, and 2 humans. Just 2, out of a rotating unit of 11. At the time, I didn't think much about that ratio. I was new enough to interstellar work that I was still in the phase where everything seemed roughly equivalent, where I was actively trying not to notice species-based differences because I'd been trained, correctly, that assuming capability differentials based on biology was a bias to resist. I still think that's right, by the way. I still think that's the correct instinct. But I also think, and 6 years of experience have taught me this, that resisting bias doesn't mean ignoring reality. And the reality of humans in mixed military units was something I was about to learn in a way that no classroom had quite prepared me for. The incident started, as many incidents do, with something small. Day 8, approximately 14:30 station time. I was in one of the common areas on Ring 3, a sort of broad, open corridor that had been widened at some point to serve as an informal gathering space. There were benches along the walls, a few food kiosks that were mediocre but better than the synthesizers, and a large observation window that looked out at nothing in particular but looked out at it dramatically, which is sometimes enough. I had a cup of something that claimed to be coffee. It was warm and dark and had caffeine in it, which was the only criteria I actually cared about at that point in the trip. And I was going over transit manifest documents on a datapad that I absolutely needed to review and was absolutely not actually reviewing. The GE patrol came through at around 14:35. I remember noticing them because the Rendaki soldier's exoskeleton clicked in a distinctive pattern when walking on the hard composite floor of that particular section, and I'd started unconsciously timing the patrols by the sound. This patrol was different. One of the 2 humans, I'll call him Carver because that was actually his name, or at least the name on his unit patch, was walking slightly ahead of the standard formation. Not dramatically, maybe half a step, but I noticed it because I'd watched enough patrols by that point that I knew what the standard formation looked like, and this wasn't quite it. The other human, a woman whose name I later learned was Reyes, was at the back of the formation. She was doing something that I can only describe in retrospect as quietly watching everything. Her eyes moved constantly, not nervously, not with the sharp tracking motion of someone spooked, but with the calm, comprehensive sweep of someone who has trained themselves to see the whole room at once and makes it look effortless. I watched them move through the common area and thought nothing particular about it, went back to my manifest documents, drank my maybe coffee. Then, at 14:47, I heard a sound that I felt in my sternum before I consciously processed it. It was an impact sound. Low, heavy, the kind of sound that's caused by mass meeting resistance suddenly. My head came up. Most people in the common area looked around with the confused, delayed reaction of people who heard something, but haven't yet determined what it means. At the far end of the common area, near the corridor junction that led toward the cargo processing bays, there was a situation developing. I'll describe it as clearly as I can, because the sequence matters. A group of 6 beings had come around the corridor junction. 4 Thavari, 2 Velhari. They weren't GE, their armor was different, darker, with markings I recognized as belonging to a private security contractor called the Shethvaro Concern, which operated on the edge of legal in about 6 different jurisdictions, and was technically registered as a logistics protection firm. They had 2 people in front of them. Being herded is the word my brain supplied immediately, even though I didn't want to use it because of what it implied, who were clearly not military. One was a young Keth brood, maybe equivalent to mid-adolescence in their developmental cycle, backpack still on, one of those flat disk communication devices they use clutched to their chest. The other was an older being I didn't recognize the species of, moving with a slight difficulty that suggested either injury or age or both. I understood what I was looking at immediately, and it made my stomach tighten. This was an intimidation corridor sweep. The HFY operators were pushing these two civilians toward the cargo corridors, away from the common area, away from witnesses. It was being done quietly, with the kind of practiced casual menace that says we've done this before, and we know exactly how much pressure to apply to make it look like nothing while it is very clearly something. I remember doing a fast mental calculation, the kind where you assess who's around, who has authority, what your actual options are, and arriving at the conclusion that my options were. 1. Activate my diplomatic liaison comm badge and hope someone senior responded within a useful time frame. 2. Shout for help in a common area and hope the noise attracted someone with actual authority. 3. Stand up and do something personally, which I'd had basic training for and absolutely no real experience with. I was reaching for option 1 when Carver appeared. I don't know where he'd come from exactly. The patrol had left the common area maybe 8 minutes earlier. He must have looped back. Or he'd never fully left. Maybe he'd posted himself near the junction, which would explain the half-step deviation from formation I'd noticed. He walked into the space between the HFY group and the two civilians, and he did it without running, without shouting, without any of the theatrical announcement you might expect from someone intending to make an intervention. He just walked in, and then he stopped, and he stood there. Now, here is where I need to try to explain something that I've spent 6 years trying to articulate, and I'm not sure I've fully succeeded yet. Carver was not physically imposing in the way that, for instance, a HFY is physically imposing. HFY are broad. They have 4 arms. Their upper body mass alone is significant. When a HFY stands in a corridor and doesn't want you to pass, the architecture of their body is making an argument that requires no words. Carver was a human of roughly average height, which in a galaxy where most species top out at something like the human equivalent of 5'6" or 5'7" meant he was actually on the taller side, but only modestly. He had the kind of build that results from genuine physical training rather than anything genetic, lean in the way that's not thin, the way that's actually dense with something you can't quite see. He was wearing standard GE tactical gear, which fit him the way gear fits someone who wears it all the time. He stood in the corridor. His hands were loose at his sides. His face was, and this is what I keep coming back to, his face was calm. Not the tense calm of someone suppressing panic. Not the performed calm of someone trying to look unafraid when they are. Just calm, like the situation had not yet arrived at anything that required him to adjust his baseline. The HFY lead, one of the Velhari, with a rank indicator on his shoulder that suggested he commanded this unit, stopped about 4 meters from Carver. He looked at Carver. He looked at the GE insignia on Carver's gear. He did a quick survey of the space around them and found what he was apparently looking for, which was one human, no obvious immediate backup. He said something in standard that I'll translate cleanly. Coalition business, move aside. Carver said, ID the civilians. The Velhari lead said, coalition business, move aside. Carver said, under transit station protocols, any enforcement action against registered civilians requires identification of party in custody and statement of grounds. I'm asking you to ID them. He said this with the same tone someone might use to ask for a receipt. The Velhari lead took a step forward. And here is what I want you to understand, because this is the part that I've told at 4 debriefs, and that made a Velhari admiral put down her stylus and stare at me for 11 seconds. Carver didn't step back. He didn't tense up in the visible way that most beings do when a larger being steps toward them. His hands didn't come up. His weight didn't shift back. His chin didn't drop. He just stood there, looking at the Velhari, and waited. And I watched the Velhari lead do something I had never seen a Velhari do before or since. He hesitated. I need to explain something about Velhari for this to land properly. Velhari don't hesitate. Or more precisely, they do, but it's a calculated hesitation, a tactical pause, the kind that's part of a decision tree. What they do not do is the involuntary hesitation, the one that comes from something in the situation not matching the expected pattern. The expected pattern in this scenario was one unit member outnumbered 6-1, confronted with an advancing senior HFY operative. Expected behavior. One of 3 options, all of which the Velhari lead had presumably encountered before and had counters for. Either the opposition steps aside, or the opposition escalates verbally and then steps aside when the physical pressure increases, or the opposition calls for backup and you manage the time gap. What was not in the expected pattern was the thing that was actually happening, which was, the opposition did not react to the approach at all in any of the ways it was supposed to react. The Velhari lead stepped forward, and Carver just stayed there, steady, still looking at him, still waiting for the ID information he'd asked for, apparently having filed the physical approach in a mental category that didn't change his current operational status. And the Velhari hesitated because he didn't know which counter to run. He'd been given a response that wasn't in the response tree. The hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, but in the context of that corridor with those stakes in that silence, it lasted forever. Then Reyes appeared. She came from the other direction, the corridor junction behind the HFY group. I hadn't seen her post there. I didn't know when she'd done it. She'd simply materialized in the space behind them with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had thought ahead, and moved early and said nothing about it. She didn't approach. She just stood at the corridor junction and looked at the group with the same calm, comprehensive attention she'd been using all patrol. The HFY group looked around, looked at Reyes, looked at Carver, looked at each other. And now the math was different. Not because the numerical advantage had changed. It hadn't, not really. There were still 6 of them and 2 of the humans, but the situation math had changed in a way that was much more important than numbers. They were boxed, not physically there was room to maneuver, but tactically, psychologically. The 2 humans had moved to positions that meant any action the HFY group took would happen in a corridor with witnesses on both ends. And at least one of those witnesses had already explicitly cited protocol and would be noting everything that happened for whatever report followed. More than that, though, more than the tactical math. It was something about the 2 humans themselves. I was watching from the side, close enough to see faces, far enough to be out of the immediate zone. And I watched the HFY group look at Carver and Reyes, and I watched them I believe this is what happened. I watched them make a threat assessment. And I watched the threat assessment come back wrong. Or not wrong exactly, just not what they expected. 6 trained operators, 2 humans. The numbers said this was manageable. The training said this was manageable. Every piece of information they could consciously access said this was manageable. But something else was saying something different. Something older, something that doesn't go through the conscious assessment system. The something that had made the Velhari lead hesitate. The Thavari operator directly behind the Velhari lead, a big one, all 4 arms at a particular angle that suggested readiness, did something interesting. He shifted his weight back. Not a step, not a retreat, just back. Like someone had adjusted the balance without meaning to. I've thought about that shift a lot. I think what the Thavari operator's body was responding to was something it had detected before his brain had caught up. Something in Carver's stillness, in Reyes' positioning, in the specific quality of calm that both humans were projecting. Something that older, deeper processing systems classified not as unthreatening, but as threat of undetermined magnitude. The most dangerous things in every biological threat response system I've ever studied are not the things that announce themselves. They're the things that don't. The things that are present and still and watching and give you no information about what they might do because they haven't decided to do anything yet. Carver wasn't threatening the HFY group. He was standing in a corridor asking for identification of civilians in compliance with transit protocols. But he was doing it the way someone does something when the outcome of not complying has not even fully occurred to them as relevant. He was doing it from a place where the 6 operators in front of him simply had not entered his mental calculation as a problem. And that specific thing is the most frightening information you can receive from another being. Not "I will hurt you," that's manageable, that has a counter-response. "You are not a factor I need to account for." That doesn't have a counter-response. Because you don't know what a being capable of that thought is actually capable of, and you have no way to find out without testing it, and you're looking at it and thinking very hard about whether you want to be the test. The Velhari lead said quietly, "Transit protocol citation acknowledged. We will provide identification." Carver said, "Thank you." That was it. That was the whole exchange. The HFY group provided transit IDs for both civilians, the Keth Brood young one, and the older being who turned out to be a registered trade delegate from a minor consortium affiliate, which meant the HFY involvement was legally problematic in at least 4 different ways that Carver's report would subsequently document. Carver made a note on his patrol datapad. He thanked the operators again. He waited while both civilians confirmed they were uninjured and proceeding voluntarily. He watched the HFY group continue down the corridor, with the specific attention of someone who is watching to see if behavior changes when they think they're no longer observed. Reyes joined him from the other end. They exchanged maybe 5 words. Then they continued their patrol. I sat with my cold maybe coffee, and I realized my hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, I think, or not only from fear. From the feeling you get when you witness something you don't have a proper category for yet. That evening I ended up at the common area food kiosk at the same time as Reyes. Timing coincidence, or I told myself that. I've since admitted to myself that I probably engineered it, at least subconsciously, because I wanted to ask her something. I got my food, another nutritionally complete meal that tasted like abstract nourishment, and I sat down near where she was, and after a few minutes of pretending to be very interested in my tray, I said, "The thing in the corridor today, were you scared?" She looked at me for a moment with the same calm assessment I'd watched her use all day. During, she said, "Yeah." She thought about it, actually thought about it, which I appreciated. "No," she said, "not really. I don't know, scared isn't quite the word. Focused, maybe. You kind of go narrow." Narrow. Like everything that isn't the thing you need to handle just drops away. You go down to just the relevant information, she shrugged. Carver trained longer than me, so he goes narrower faster. I still have to work at it a little. I nodded, thought about that. "Those 6 operators," I said, "they backed down from 2 of you." She looked at me in a way that suggested she was considering whether I was making a point or asking a question. "Yeah," she said. "Why do you think that happened?" She ate a bite of her food, made a face that was probably about the taste. Then she said, thoughtfully, like she was working it out as she went, "I think people can tell when something's going to be expensive. You know, like not always the thing that's going to win. Sometimes the thing that's going to be expensive even if you win." She paused. "We weren't going to beat 6 HFY operators in a direct physical confrontation. Probably not. But they knew, I think they knew that they'd pay for it, whatever happened after. We weren't going to make it easy. And that was enough to stop them. It was enough to make the math not work," she said. "If you're doing something you shouldn't be doing and the cost of doing it goes up high enough, you find another time." I sat with that for a while. "Were you angry?" I asked. She gave that the same honest consideration. "At them?" She tilted her head. "No, not really. They were doing what they do. People who use intimidation as a tool, that's just a thing that exists." She picked up her drink. "I was annoyed, maybe. At the idea that those 2 civilians had to walk through that. That bothers me more than the operators themselves. The operators are doing their job, even if their job is gross. The civilians are just trying to get somewhere." She said it the way you say something you've thought about before, and arrived at a position on that you're comfortable with. Not performed empathy, just the actual thing. I reported what I witnessed to the diplomatic team's security lead, who filed it appropriately. The subsequent report revealed that the 2 individuals being herded by the HFY group were connected to the trade delegation we were accompanying, through 2 degrees of separation. A fact that elevated the incident from general misconduct to something with direct political implications for our mission. The HFY concerns contracts with 2 of the parties involved in our negotiation were quietly restructured within the next 48 hours. I don't know all the details, and I'm not cleared to share the ones I do know. But I'll say that the incident in the corridor had ripple effects that extended well past the corridor. None of that would have happened if Carver hadn't stepped into the space. If he'd done the sensible calculation, 6-to-1, mixed unit, wait for backup, those 2 civilians would have ended up in the cargo corridors having a conversation that would have been very bad for them and very productive for whoever had sent the HFY group. He didn't do the sensible calculation. Or rather, he did a calculation that came out differently than the one I would have done. The one I think most beings in that situation would have done. Because his version of the risk assessment didn't include the variable I would have weighted most heavily, which is, what happens to me if I'm wrong about being able to handle this? That variable wasn't in his math. I don't fully understand why. I've asked a few humans since then, and the answers I get are different but somehow similar. They use phrases like "you just do it," and "it wasn't really a choice," and "someone had to," and my personal favorite, from a tactical trainer I interviewed 2 years later. The situation required a response, and I was there, so I responded. As if the question of whether they were capable of the response was so secondary as to be almost irrelevant. The situation required a response. I was there. 3 weeks after I got back from Orinthex 7, I was in a briefing at the Diplomatic Academy, a retrospective on our mission, and one of the analysts presenting was a Velhari named SS Tharivel, who had compiled security incident reports from 63 transit stations over the previous 4 years. She was discussing patterns in GE intervention effectiveness. I was listening with one part of my attention because I was also trying to eat a sandwich without making noise in a briefing setting, which is harder than it sounds. Then she said something that made me put the sandwich down. She said, human operators in mixed units show statistically anomalous response patterns in high-threat situations. What makes this anomalous is not effectiveness. Many species show high effectiveness. What is anomalous is the variance in perceived threat. Specifically, human operators appear, on average, to perceive themselves as significantly less at risk in situations where objective threat assessment would rate the risk level as extreme. Someone in the room asked, "You mean they underestimate the threat?" SS Tharivel paused, and then she said something I wrote down immediately and have thought about since. "No, we believe they accurately perceive the threat. They simply do not respond to it the way the threat level would predict. There is a dissociation between threat assessment and threat response that is unusual in cross-species comparison. Most species show a linear or near-linear relationship between perceived threat level and behavioral response. Humans show something else." "What do you mean by something else?" the same person asked. "We don't have a precise term for it yet," she said. "The closest translation from Velhari analytical taxonomy would be the unbothered undertaking of necessary things, which is not a great translation, I acknowledge." There was a silence in the briefing room. Someone muttered something I didn't catch. The person across from me, a senior diplomat named Pharaoh Human, who had been doing this work for 20-something years, made a small, amused sound. Like he'd heard this characterization before from the outside and found it both accurate and somewhat funny. I leaned over and said quietly, "Is that right? Do you think that's accurate?" Pharaoh thought for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that most humans spend a lot of time doing things that are scary while not letting the scariness determine whether they do the thing." "Why?" He gave me the look of a man being asked to explain water to a fish. "Because the thing needs doing," he said, "and we're here." There's a particular memory from my 3rd year working interstellar diplomatic assignments that keeps surfacing when I think about all of this. I was on a research station, not a military posting, purely civilian, very calm by comparison, and one of the station's systems malfunctions had caused a coolant line failure in one of the lower maintenance decks. It wasn't catastrophic. It was serious but manageable. The station's automated systems were dealing with it, and there was no immediate danger to personnel. What no one had noticed, because the manifest hadn't updated correctly following a personnel rotation, was that there was a Dravathi researcher still working in a lab adjacent to the failed coolant section. Dravathi are highly sensitive to the specific compound that had leaked. Not immediately lethal, but fast-acting enough that time mattered. The maintenance team coordinator, a human named Park, who I knew from the cafeteria and who was quiet and methodical, and had told me 3 days earlier that his main hobby was growing tomatoes hydroponically in his quarters, looked at the situation report, looked at the timeline, looked at the atmosphere readings from the adjacent lab showing compound infiltration, and walked into the compromised section in a sealed suit to get the researcher out. The suit was rated for 15 minutes of exposure at that compound concentration. He was in there for 9. He came out with the Dravathi researcher over his shoulder in a carry that I later learned is called a fireman's carry, and he set her down in the corridor, and immediately handed her off to the medical team, and then sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and spent about 2 minutes doing something with his breathing that I now recognize as deliberate physiological regulation, but at the time just looked like a man sitting quietly. I asked him later, because apparently asking people about their moments of accidental heroism is something I've noticed. I asked him if he'd been scared. He said, "Yes, absolutely. I was terrified the whole time." And I said, "But you went in anyway." And he said, and this is the one that really hit me, this one specifically, he said, "Well, yeah, she was in there, I had the suit. What was I going to do, stand outside? What was I going to do, stand outside?" Said like it was the obvious thing. Said like not going in was the option that would have required explanation. I've been in this work long enough now to have had many conversations about humans with non-human colleagues, and I've noticed a pattern in how those conversations go. Usually they start from a position of physical capability. Humans are strong, humans have endurance, humans have a uniquely high pain tolerance, humans have this biological feature or that physiological quirk that makes them unusual. And all of that is true. All of that is real and documented, and you can pull up the comparative biology studies if you want the data. But the physical stuff isn't actually what comes up when I ask people who have worked alongside humans in high-pressure situations. When I ask people who have been there, what they actually remember, what stays with them, they don't usually lead with the physical. They lead with something harder to categorize. A Keth Brood logistics officer I worked with for 6 months told me, "What I cannot get used to is the deciding." The humans I work with, they seem to decide to do difficult things in about 1/5 of the time I would need. And then they just do them. The gap between deciding and doing is very small. It worries me sometimes. But it also means that when something needs doing right now, I know who I'm looking for. A Rendaki structural engineer I knew said, "The humans on my team, they do this thing where they become very quiet when something is wrong. Most people become louder, more signals. The humans go quiet and still and then move very fast and very precisely. It took me a long time to understand that the quiet was not confusion. The quiet was something else. It was like a machine that has stopped making processing noise because all the power is going somewhere else." A Thavari medic I spoke to at a conference said, with the particular bluntness that Thavari often have, "They scare me a little and I have worked with them for 12 years. The scary thing is they don't know. You can see them not knowing. They think they are ordinary and they are not ordinary and they genuinely do not know. They genuinely do not know." I went back to Orenthek 7 once, 2 years after the incident. Different mission, unrelated. Just a transit stop, 2 days. I wasn't even sure why I wanted to walk through the common area again, but I did. The observation window still looked out at nothing dramatically. The food kiosks were different. 1 had been replaced, 2 had new operators. The lighting was exactly the same uncomfortable blend of 3 eras of illumination. I walked the corridor near the cargo junction, stood in roughly the same spot where Carver had stood. Thought about that Velhari lead doing his threat assessment and arriving at a hesitation he hadn't expected. Thought about the weight shift of the Thavari operator, that small, involuntary move backward. Thought about Ray's eating her terrible station food and saying people can tell when something's going to be expensive. Thought about Pharaoh saying the thing needs doing and we're here. Thought about Park sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, breathing deliberately, after walking into a compromised section in a 15-minute suit. She was in there, I had the suit. What was I going to do, stand outside? There's a specific quality to human courage that I've spent years trying to name properly, and I don't think I've quite gotten there, but what I keep coming back to is this. It's not that humans don't feel fear. Every human I've ever asked has said yes, they feel it clearly, acutely, sometimes intensely. It's that the fear and the action seem to run on separate tracks. The fear is there, noted, real, and the action happens anyway, not despite the fear exactly, not suppressing the fear. More like, the fear gets filed under relevant information, and the action gets filed under what happens next, and the two are both present simultaneously, without one canceling the other. Most beings I've encountered experience fear as something that interrupts the action circuit, as a stop signal, a wait and reassess. For humans, it seems to work more like a warning light on a dashboard, while the vehicle keeps moving. The warning is real. The vehicle is still moving. And I think I genuinely believe this, having thought about it for years, that humans don't fully understand this about themselves. Not as a species, not at the individual level. They know they do it, but they don't quite grasp from the inside what it looks like from the outside. They don't grasp what it does to the threat assessment of every other being in the room when you step into a corridor with 6 armed operators, and your face says you haven't given me any information that changes my current status. The Velhari admiral who made the 11-second comment, I met her again about a year after that second visit to Orinthex 7. A diplomatic function, nothing operational. She remembered me, which surprised me because Velhari memory for specific individuals is notoriously selective. She said, "You are the one who told me about the corridor incident on Orinthex 7. I said, "Yes, that was me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been in discussions with my counterparts about human integration in coalition security units. The discussion often comes back to the same point, which is that the presence of human operators changes the threat calculus in situations in ways that are disproportionate to number. 2 humans produce a deterrent effect that is not explained by 2 units of physical capability." "What do you think explains it?" I asked. She considered. "We have a concept in Velhari threat analysis," she said slowly. "The concept is roughly translated as the adversary who has not finished their accounting. It refers to an opponent who you cannot fully assess because they have not yet committed to a specific action. An opponent in the middle of a decision where the decision's outcome is not yet visible." She paused. "Most beings, when confronted," she said, "signal their decision state quickly. They show you where they are in the process. They escalate or they de-escalate. The signal is legible. And humans, she said, remain unreadable for longer. In a threat situation, they stay in a state that appears from outside as not yet decided, which means you cannot counter them because you don't know what you're countering, which means the cost of any action against them is unknown, which means if you have a choice. You find another time, I said. She looked at me. Yes, exactly. Reyes said something like that. Reyes was correct. She was quiet again. Then, the disturbing thing is not that humans are dangerous. The disturbing thing is that they don't seem to know. Because if they knew, if they understood the effect they have, the presence they carry into a room, I think they would use it differently. I think they would be more deliberate. And instead, she said, they continue to walk into corridors and ask for identification in calm voices and stand there looking at things like the things aren't particularly relevant to whether they're about to stand there or not. A pause that was the Velhari equivalent of a small sigh. It is very hard to counter, because there is nothing to counter. They are just there, being what they are, and whatever they are appears to be, upon assessment, very expensive to challenge. I've been telling this story for 6 years. I'll probably keep telling it for the rest of my career, maybe beyond that. It's the kind of story that turns over in your mind in quiet moments, when you're waiting for a transit connection, when the station ambient noise drops at odd hours, when you're eating food that doesn't taste like food and looking at an observation window that looks out at nothing dramatically. The thing about Orinthex 7, the thing about Carver and Reyes and the Shethvaro group and the Velhari lead who hesitated and the Thavari operator who shifted his weight back without meaning to, the thing about all of it is that nothing dramatic happened. No shots fired, no injuries, no extended confrontation. A patrol stopped, asked for IDs, received them, made a report, moved on. That was all. And yet a mid-level intimidation operation quietly abandoned its objective. And yet 2 civilians made it to their destination without a conversation they were never supposed to have. And yet ripple effects extended to the edges of a negotiation that was already tense, and contracts were restructured, and the Shethvaro concern's reach in those corridors was curtailed in ways that had consequences I've only partially been able to trace. All of that because one human stepped into the space between something wrong and the people it was being done to. Because the situation required a response, and he was there. Because she was in there, and he had the suit. Because the thing needs doing, and we're here. I think about the Velhari Admiral's phrase sometimes, when I'm lying awake in station quarters at 3 in the morning listening to recycled air. The adversary who has not finished their accounting. The one whose decision you can't read yet because they haven't made it yet, or haven't shown you that they've made it. And I think about how what looks like calm, from inside a human, might be something more like the quiet before a very large and very simple decision. Not a complicated decision, not an agonized one. Just, is this the thing that needs doing? Yes, am I here? Yes. Then, the Velhari Admiral is right. It's not that humans are dangerous. It's that they don't know. They genuinely move through the world like ordinary beings doing ordinary things, slightly baffled by the attention, slightly impatient with the analysis, largely unaware of the shape they cut in every threat assessment in every room they walk into. Standing in corridors, asking for IDs, walking into compromised sections with 15-minute suits, stepping between wrong things and the people the wrong things are being done to. What was I going to do? Stand outside? There is, in that question, no trace of awareness that for most beings in that situation, standing outside would have been the obvious answer, the correct answer, the answer that threat assessment returns when you run the numbers. Humans don't run those numbers. Or they run them, and something in the output doesn't quite reach the part of them that decides what to do next. I don't know which it is. I'm not sure they know which it is. I'm not sure it matters. The situation required a response, they were there. And somewhere in that simple arithmetic is something that a Velhari Admiral put down her stylus for. Something that makes experienced operators shift their weight back without meaning to. Something that moves through the galaxy quietly, in standard-issue tactical gear, looking at things the way you look at things when the things have not yet given you any information that changes your current status. Something that walks into corridors. Something that doesn't seem to know what it is. And that not knowing, that calm, that simple stubborn arithmetic of the thing needs doing, and I am here. That might be the most terrifying thing about them. Not because it's violent, because you can't calculate it, because it doesn't negotiate with your threat assessment, because it just keeps being there, standing, waiting, asking for ID in a voice that has no idea it's the most frightening sound in the room.